Well, Bob, you know, we've been working on films for a long time now.
I think since 1998, maybe?
Right.
Something like about 12, 13 years at this point.
Yeah. When I came to you with this concept of When the Mountain Calls, what was your first impression?
Well, I thought it would be an interesting film. I did have some concerns about how, because, you know, we're incorporating pieces and stories from like 3 or 4 of your different films over the years.
Right.
And so my concern was how will we create a theme that's going to bring all this together?
Right, and as an editor, that's your job, so you certainly need to be concerned.
Yeah. But fortunately, we also had a scriptwriter.
Right, right. So when I show up with all of this content, I mean, this is literally, how many hours of footage would you say?
Dozens and dozens of
right.
hours, yeah.
And I propose a concept to you. How do you kind of conceptualize it and put it into something that could be edited down to, you know, an hour or so?
I think because I've been, you know, working in the video business for over 35 years, I guess I really hadn't thought about what my process is, but to think about it now is, usually what I do is try to get an overview of what that is. And, you know, we'll sit and kind of go through some tapes, and then when you leave, I'll go through some other tapes and take a look at that. And a lot of my process is just inputting that into my being and then live with that. You know, for a couple weeks or a month, or sometimes it takes a couple months to come up with something cohesive. You know, it's sort of like the more input, the more hours of footage we have, the longer it takes. But it's sort of like an automatic process within me that sort of sorts things out and says, well, let's try this. And a lot of times, fortunately, there are some options there.
Right. So you're not only dealing with images. We're talking about the soundtrack
with
elements. Paul Horn and Christopher Hedges' music that literally brings things to life, in my opinion, but also the narration. Right. So
the narration on this film was rather interesting because, you know, initially when you came to me, you were going to narrate.
Yeah, that's right.
Narrate the film.
Right. I gave it a shot.
That's right. Actually, in the initial concept, it was, you know, your journal, and so it was like you telling your story, and we said, of course, you have to tell it because nobody else can tell your story. And then after Rick did his magnificent script writing, then there ended up being 2 parts. There was your part, and then there was a narrator part.
Right.
And how was that, reading your part?
Well, for me, I became very self-conscious, and when I heard it the first time, I thought, no way. I want Bob Stone to do it. He makes commercials. He's a professional. So it only made sense to me that you do it. But I don't know how you felt about it at the time.
Well, I felt funny being Tom. So how it started out was Tom read his part, and then I read the narration part.
Right.
Then when Ann Mortafee was here and offered to do the narration part, then I took over your part.
Because she had narrated the Bhutan film.
Bhutan film. Excellent
job. And did such a wonderful job, right. And again, it just kind of fell into place in my mind.
Yeah. Once that hit and all the parties involved, you know, looked and listened to it and just looked at it, you go like, yeah.
The Tengbuche Monastery was a welcome sight, as it had been for Norgay and Hillary as well. Tom learned that back in 1953, when they had reached the roof of the world, the summit of Everest, the monastery was the only landmark they could see. Perhaps humanity's last sanctuary, there on the line where earth and heaven meet. Or was it instead a launch pad into a different realm altogether, a realm of simplicity and higher values?
So Rick and I are sitting here talking about this new film, When the Mountain Calls. Well, originally the film was going to be a short film focusing on climate and cultural change in the Himalaya region. And I went to China and actually met with Greenpeace China. There were at least 60 or 70 young people working in this high-rise building in Beijing. They were there basically working on making a difference in China regarding pollution and hopefully trying to change climate change issues. I mean, they were promoting saving the glaciers, for example, in Tibet. In fact, they even trekked there and had a big banner up, "Save the glaciers in Tibet," because it's literally their fresh water supply. So 1 billion people depend on the glaciers and the fresh water coming off the Himalayas. I was extremely impressed, again, that this was going on in China. In fact, at the same time, Blaise Noto and I were there, and we witnessed them banning plastic bags in China. This was, 3 years ago, you know, before we even considered it here on Maui, for example. So anyway, after going to China, returning home, you know, I was diagnosed with cancer and was treated. And then rather than wanting to rest, because I was very weak and tired and even kind of depressed, to be honest with you, I had this strong urge to go to the Himalaya mountains. And I talked to my wife about it, and she said, well, maybe you need to make a pilgrimage there. And I thought, what a great opportunity. So that's basically what I did, and it resulted in this film. Because as I was trekking, all of these memories came up of the past, probably past 30 years of my kind of experiences in the Himalaya region that some would consider kind of magical or unexplainable or whatever, and I used to always kind of discount.
Well, you know, what's fascinating about this is that there are a lot of questions to it that I still don't have answers to. Here we are on the brink of releasing it to audiences, and we're still sitting here. It seems to have a life of its own, beginning with the title itself, When the Mountain Calls. And what you're talking about is this kind of sense of looking at your own situation and being almost in a place where you have to. I hate to use terms like surrender, but there are forces at work, and you don't know what to do with them. And at some point you have to say, gosh, I don't have any choice here. I have to go with it. And I think that's what the title of the film speaks about, and that's what the film speaks about as well, is just being open to things.
We've certainly had many conversations over the last year or so, and we kind of relate in terms of, I think, where we're both coming from in terms of the subject matter. But it was truly your words that brought it to life, and I want to thank you for that. But where were you coming from in terms of putting the script together?
Well, you know, when you first brought it up to me, I was very flattered and honored that you would think of me in that way. And I immediately said, well, sure, I'd be happy to. And it wasn't until I started thinking about it afterwards, and I think I mentioned to you, at that point I said, oh, Tom, I know I said I would do this, but I just thought you might want to know I don't know how. And so it was really a process of having to learn how, or teach myself how, or figure out. So the way the film came about, I don't know whether this is how these things are done. From my standpoint, it feels to me like it was kind of backwards, because you had your experience, you had your journal, you had a rough cut of your footage, and you had music by Paul Horn.
Right.
And that's what you brought to me. And then so, okay, here it is. And you know, originally I was thinking, well, I'll act as a script doc, as a consultant, as an editor, basically, and just look at what you've done and kind of mark up your journal, and we'll go with it like that. And what happened was, it was a matter of trying to, for myself, let you say what you were trying to say. So it's absolutely your movie, and it's absolutely your story, and in a certain sense, I guess that is what I was the script doctor. I mean, it's really an honor to get credit for writing the thing. I've been thinking about it lately, and I'm thinking, no, it's your story. And
but on the other hand, because of our previous conversations, I think we're very much on the same page in terms of the way we think, at least in terms of philosophy and this whole thing of surrendering to the unknown. And I think you really captured that, because in the film, there were experiences that I could not explain. And being a psychologist, I've always had to be put in the positions of position of having objective type of material. I worked with a seriously mentally ill, and my role is to ground people. So when these things happen, like being on the, trekking in the Himalaya mountains with Tenzing Norgay to meet Hillary for the first time, all by chance, that's unexplainable. Is it karma, or is it just being in the right place at the right time? What is it? How are you able to conceptualize that?
Well, you and I have talked about the notion that the word coincidence may be an inadequate concept. Things happen in our experience, and we say, well, that's a coincidence. And so we explain it that way. But there's a sense that it's almost like there's some force at work that's just over the next ridge that we can't quite see,
right.
But that's what's making these things happen. And so I don't exactly have an answer to that. I think you and I think the thing that brought us together was we tend to look at things kind of through the same eyes. And I don't know whether the context is philosophical or psychological or spiritual, or maybe those three words are all part of the same. Maybe those are all different ways of talking about the same thing. And so we're kind of looking at that in the film. The film, in one sense, the film is just about you keep going to the Himalayas and keep going to base camp, but in another sense, in certain Eastern teachings, you're always a beginner. It's really a matter of being open, of getting out of your own way, getting just getting rid of your misconceptions. And once you do, all sorts of magic things are there to see, but you have to get your own stuff out of the way to see it.
And that relates very much to what Anne Mortifee was talking about, being in love with the mystery. And I thought that was a wonderful concept and related so much to the film in terms of its content.
And the way Anne came on board, it's like the film so much has a life of its own.
Right.
It started with your story, and you sort of brought it to me, and I added another piece of it. And then it was a matter of, okay, so we started to have a film, and then we had a narrative track, and then Anne, who's married to Paul, came in.
Just happened to be here on vacation.
Took a look at it, and Anne said, gee, would you like me to narrate it? And Chris Christopherson got involved in the same way, that he's sort of a mutual friend of both of ours, but was attracted seemingly because the film was trying to talk about spiritual things, and I think that resonated with Chris.
In 1983, a young man in Flagstaff, Arizona heard the mountains calling out to him. For there are places that call to us, places that draw us deeper into ourselves, and yet, while they draw us deeper, they at the same time seem to open and awaken us to a mystery beyond our reach. And since that time, Tom Vendetti has spent almost 3 decades returning again and again, drawn by something as powerful as it is elusive. The thin air, the dazzling blue skies, and the unguarded smiles of people who have a different understanding of what happiness means.
It's very cool because in one sense, the movie is an adventure story, but it's not an adventure story in a conventional way of triumphing over the mountain at all. It's really much more about you start out looking at the mountain peak, and then you learn to set your vision closer to the ground. And closer to the ground, you start seeing not only the smiling faces of the people in that region, but their entire approach to life, which is really an inspiration to us in the West. I'm still at a loss to figure out. We have in our culture so much. And yet the most basic things like happiness are so elusive for us. And you go there to this remote place, and they're right in touch with happiness. It's no problem for them.
Yeah, in fact, happiness is a major theme of the film, of course. What I had been searching for probably 30 years, And again, being a psychologist, I've always been interested in that concept. And in terms of making the Bhutan film, that was one of the primary motives, gross national happiness, basically exploring that whole theme. But once you go to a place like the Himalayas, something happens. And I'm not to this day, can't explain exactly what happens, but I just know I feel better. I feel much more contentment within. That's the way I would describe happiness, for example.
Well, contentment is a concept that doesn't come up at all in our culture, and I really think that you're exactly right. That our sense of happiness it has more to do with consumer items, or we somehow think it's out there. Right. I haven't found it yet, but it must be out there, and I just have been looking in the wrong place. And well, yeah, because probably the place you should be looking is in the mirror, and what the happiness is, what contentment is about, is, you know, it's not wanting that. It's like saying, "Gosh, look what I've got! Isn't that wonderful?"
Yeah, yeah.
Ascending into the clouds, they occasionally encountered others. They were not on a trek. They were on a never-ending prayer wheel that circumnavigated the mountain.
Again, I was taken by how devoted the pilgrims were to their culture and religion. Could their values and belief system be strong enough to overcome the influences of the Chinese and the West? On the other hand, everything from China and the West wasn't bad. Buddhist teachings encourage taking the middle path, the best from both worlds. Could it be that Tibet was on this path? Would they be able to retain their innate happiness in the face of so much change?
One of the things that I loved working with you on was the music and picking the different songs that Paul Horn and Christopher Hedge did to bring these scenes to life.
Yeah.
And it's such an important element in my mind. What Chris would do, often he would travel with us on site and record all of the natural sounds.
Right.
And then he would take that and do his magic and add different instruments, primarily Paul Horn's flute, which is so appropriate for the Himalayan region because that is probably the primary flute for the mountains. So again, it all seemed to just fit and work together.
Yeah. I had the wonderful opportunity of experiencing Christopher Hedge firsthand. Right. Because he went with us on the Bhutan trip. And we were roommates together. And just for me, I've been involved in sound, but never really, well, I take that back. I was on the sound crew filming motorcycles, so I was capturing a lot of sound. Right. But never really natural sounds and sounds of instruments and people chanting and that type of thing. And so to spend time with Chris, you know, both when we're just walking through Bhutan and when we're filming.
Well, really two tech guys in a room together in Bhutan.
But to see him work, not only capturing the images, but then I remember one night he came back and he was so excited because he had, I think, some samples in his power book at the time, and he recorded these new sounds during the day. And I was there when he composed the theme for the Bhutan film.
Right.
And it was amazing that, you know, he put this all together, and I was learning about Live, I think was one of the programs he was using. And just to see him put that all together firsthand, you know, watching the hands of a master and the mind of a master. And he has such a great attitude about life and about his work. He just loves it.
Yes.
You know, and it's real apparent in the product, the end product.
Right. You know, it's really interesting when we look back at how we got involved in different projects.
Right.
And one is, we've mentioned the Bhutan film, for example.
How'd that come about?
Well, John Wareheim, who we know, we worked on the Taylor Camp film together,
Right.
was showing his pictures, his photographs, the black and white stills at the East-West Center. And it was announced on public radio at the time, and Nancy, my wife, said, oh, you ought to go over there and look at his pictures and meet this guy, because you've always been interested in Bhutan. And I thought, yeah, it sounds like a good idea. So, of course, I got on the plane, flew over there and met John. And then I said, you know, John, I've always wanted to do a documentary about Bhutan. And he said, it's probably not likely. You know, they're not really allowing people into the country to do that. But we know this young person, Tinley Choden, that could possibly hook you up. She's here at the East-West Center working on her master's degree. So we went out to dinner together, and again, I proposed my idea of going into Bhutan. And even Tinley was saying, the likelihood of that happening is not, you know, very probability. The probability of happening is pretty, you know, slim.
And is that because they really weren't allowing Westerners into their country so much?
They were allowing Westerners in to do kind of travel themes, but I wanted to do something more than that, about the hydroelectric energy that they were producing, and it eventually emerged to this concept of gross national happiness, which was political at the time. And because it was political, that really, you know, possibly could have hindered our chances. So I said, well, what I'll do, I'll write a proposal and send it in, you know, to the government. And naively, as I in terms of the way I kind of stumble through life, I write a proposal and address it to the king of Bhutan, put it in the mail. And luckily, Tinley was back in Bhutan at that time and got a hold of it and said, I can't send it to the king, you have to send it to the Minister of Tourism or Film or the appropriate personnel, right? So she did that, and even then we really didn't think that anything was going to really happen. And several weeks or several months later, I got this fax saying, your proposal's been accepted. When are you coming to Bhutan? So then I got on the phone. Remember, I called you.
That's
I called
right.
Paul Horing, Christopher Head. She said, man, we're going to Bhutan. We have to, you know, make this film about gross national happiness. And everyone's going, gross? What in the world is gross national
I've heard
happiness?
Of gross national product in this country.
Right. And even I was very skeptical at the time, thinking, is this country really sincere about, you know, promoting happiness for its people? You know, being a Westerner, that's the way we think. So we arrived there, and again, all of these kind of beautiful things started appearing. The first thing, of course, was meeting the Prime Minister and hearing him talk about the whole concept and how sincere the government was in promoting happiness for its country. You know, and being a psychologist, I thought, man, this could be a model for the world. And just the fact that we were the first Westerners over there to be able to do this was also very special. You know, it's kind of like, why is this happening? Or why are we the ones that were allowed here to do this first? Yeah. But we felt very honored, and we made an Emmy-Award-winning film as a product of that, and we're very proud of it.
Yeah. I remember talking with the Prime Minister there, and although there was some semblance of sort of ceremony and that a bit getting in, you know, to see him go sit in this room and wait there.
Right, all the protocol.
Protocol and all. But I just remember how sincere I felt he was when he was speaking.
Yes.
It didn't feel political or put on or that type of thing. It just seemed like a real, like here are these people in the government that are really sincere about creating better conditions for the people that live there.
Material development is not adequate. It has to be a balanced development with a human face, a people-centered development. And that's why we try to take into account not just economic development, but other factors, social factors, the national environment, culture, governance, etc. The environment should be looked after, it should be conserved, and we feel that the natural environment of Bhutan is an integral part of our life. In fact, it is the good environment that has sustained the Bhutanese people for a very long time.
So the Prime Minister talks about preserving culture and the environment, and basically saying if you don't have a beautiful environment to live in, you're not likely to be that happy.
That's why I moved out of LA.
Yeah, that's why we live in Hawaii,
that's why we live
right?
in Maui, sure.
Exactly. And the same with culture. If you don't have a sense of identity or what your culture is about, it's hard to, again, have a sense of happiness. You may feel lost as a people, right? So that has been very influential in terms of my films over the years, preserving nature and also culture.
I noticed that a lot of the countries that you've been to, and sort of an underlying theme that comes through, and I think because it's so prevalent there, is Buddhism.
Right. Although there was Fiji Firewalkers, right? So I don't know.
That was in a little different part of the world.
Different part of the world, but again, their culture was so important to them, and you know, and their whole sense of identity of walking on these hot rocks, and you know, and then turning it into ecotourism, in number one, educating the tourist about what their culture is all about, and secondly, preserving the environment, because again, these beautiful islands bring people there, and so it all works hand in hand, I believe.
Yeah.
Findings revealed evidence that human occupation dates back to 2,700 years.
This happiness concept brings up this whole idea of Taylor Camp, a movie that you directed.
Right.
You have these so-called hippies looking for this utopia, or you know, this place that will bring happiness to their life. What was that all about?
Taylor Camp is a location on the north shore of Kauai that was owned by Howard Taylor, and Howard Taylor being Elizabeth Taylor's brother. He owned this piece of property, and he had heard in the news about these 13 hippies that had come over and had gotten away from the mainland, and that had ended up in jail for vagrancy because they didn't have money and they didn't have a job and they didn't have a place to stay. And he wanted to build his house on this piece of property,
right,
and the state had denied his permit. And so he was kind of pissed off at them, and he heard about these hippies in jail and said, you know what? Why don't you guys come? I'll give you some work. You can live there on my land, and therefore they fulfilled their vagrancy thing.
Right.
So he put them to work, and he gave them a place to live there on what became known as Taylor Camp.
Right.
So it was really a group of people that started out living in tents. There was a lot of transients that came there. A couple summers, there were a lot of surfers that came there. And as people stayed there over time, with the seasons and all, you know, you get the high waves in the
right,
wintertime come washing in, and they say, you know what, we need to build up. We need to get a little bit higher. And so they formed actually a treehouse community.
Wow.
In the trees there, building it with local wood, some remnants from a Filipino camp that was being torn down, plastic, that type of thing. Just created sort of this, you know, these weatherproof, as much as possible, houses right there on.
Some of them are quite elegant.
Oh, elegant.
Right.
So Taylor Camp is really the story of how the camp came to be, how it formed, and then its transition over the years, and the experiences that people had there in their daily lifestyle and their spiritual practices, and what they do for fun, how they get away from there.
Right.
And it's really a story about the people's stories. We were asked, and I've been asked several times, like, well, who are you going to have narrate it? I said,
Right.
well,
Yeah.
we've decided not to have a narrator. In the typical sense, documentary would have a narrator that says, you know, here's what happened. But we chose, and I chose, to have the Taylor campers tell their story.
Right.
And it seems to be pretty effective. It's a little different, but it's true to Taylor Camp.
Right.
It's true to those campers that were there.
Yeah, it seemed to really, with the different interviews, capture what Taylor Camp was all about in their own words.
Yeah.
And a lot of it's very different in terms of the experiences.
Well, it's one of the guys says, you know, Taylor Camp is a microcosm, and the whole interview experience was a microcosm, because you'd have one person say, oh, it was this way.
Right, right.
And, you know, 2 interviews later, somebody says, you know, it was this way. And what it all comes down to is everybody has their own unique perspective and their own unique experience of any particular event that happens. And so through this film, we used those comments from diverse points of view to show the diversity that actually existed there at Taylor Camp.
As an editor, Is it really possible to stay neutral when you're putting a show together?
You're talking about the documentary format?
Yeah, if you use a documentary format. Because I'm often also asked that question. But, you know, you're influence the audience with music, you know, that's not necessarily verbal in a speaking sense.
Right.
But how do you maintain that being neutral? Or is it important, in your opinion?
With a story like Taylor Camp, my goal was to show the diversity.
Right.
The factual information that we had, I'm not sure it was all that factual, you know. We have news, so you take the newspaper, you know, it's reporting things, you know, there's some facts there, but it has a particular point of view as well.
And a biased.
You know, so it's biased.
Yeah.
I guess the thing about Taylor Camp is everybody had their own truth there.
Right, right.
You know, and there is almost, there's like no way to tell the absolute truth of, you know, what happened there, because everything is from everybody's point of view.
Right.
And so what I did as an editor and director is, my attempt was to show a diversity and to attempt to sort of keep it balanced as far as here's the good, here's the bad, here's the black, here's the white, and let the audience just get a feel for the diversity of what was going on there.
Yeah.
That's about as true as I can be to being neutral.
Yeah, I think you did a good job.
Thanks.
Congratulations.
Thanks.